Shadow's promise, the rain had stopped, but the world was still drowning. In the aftermath of the hurricane, among fallen trees and debris, where a neighborhood once stood proud, a dog sat perfectly still. He didn't whimper. He didn't bark. He didn't bark. He simply watched the flooded road with unwavering focus, as if the waters might part and bring back what he had lost. His coat, once white and gray, was now mud-brown and matted against his ribs. One ear stood alert while the other drooped, giving him a perpetually questioning look. A frayed rope bound him to the remains of a porch, the only piece of a home still standing. The rope was pulled tight, forcing his chin down, yet his eyes never left the road. What makes a creature hope when all evidence suggests there's nothing left to hope for? I saw him from the rescue boat, a statue amid chaos. While others called out, moved, searched, he remained still, a quiet sentinel guarding nothing but memory. The dog didn't acknowledge our approach, not when the boat's motor cut through the silence, not when I called out softly, not even when I splashed through knee-deep water toward him. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, as if his family might appear any moment, as if the last 3 days of devastation were just a temporary inconvenience. I recognized that look. I'd seen it in disaster zones across the world, in shelter cages, and sometimes in my own reflection. "Hey there," I said, crouching down in the murky water, keeping my distance. "You've been waiting a long time, haven't you?" No reaction. Just the steady rise and fall of his ribs beneath skin stretched too tight. I pulled a protein bar from my pocket, emergency rations, broke off a piece and placed it on what remained of the porch step between us. His eyes flickered, just once, to the food, then back to the road. A tremor ran through his body, but he didn't move. I placed another piece closer to him. "Take your time," I whispered. "I've nowhere to be right now." The wind carried the scent of mold, gasoline, and salt. His nose twitched once, twice. Then slowly, with deliberate caution, he stretched forward just enough to take the food without moving his body from its vigilant position. Then he looked at me, truly looked, for the first time. What I saw wasn't fear or anger or even desperation. It was something far more devastating. Hope. Faint, exhausted but stubbornly present. I reached for the rope around his neck. "It's okay now," I said softly. "You don't have to wait anymore." And that's how I met Shadow, bound to the remains of a life washed away, still believing someone might return. But from that moment on, I would become the one who never left. He didn't resist when I worked at the knots binding him to the splintered wood. The rope had left raw, inflamed circles around his neck. When I finally freed him, he didn't run, didn't move at all. He simply sat down in the mud and looked up at me as if freedom was a concept he no longer understood. "I'm Liam Miller, search and rescue specialist, turned animal rescue coordinator after too many missions with more bodies than survivors." 3 days into hurricane relief efforts, Shadow was the first living thing I'd found in this sector since the waters receded. "Come on, boy," I said, and to my surprise, he stood on unsteady legs and followed me to the boat without hesitation. I lifted him. He weighed almost nothing, just bone and wet fur, and placed him on the small dry platform. He didn't make a sound, just leaned against my leg when I sat beside him, his breathing shallow and quick. My partner, Rio, steered us back toward the makeshift emergency shelter we'd established at the town's community center on higher ground. Shadow's eyes never left the flooded neighborhood until it disappeared around a bend. I kept one hand on his back, feeling each breath like a question. "You're all right now," I told him, though we both knew it wasn't true yet. "I've got you." He blinked once, then closed his eyes, not out of trust, but pure exhaustion. Dr. Maya Chen met us at the shelter entrance, gloves already on. her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. 3 days into disaster response, we all looked half dead, but Maya moved with the focused energy of someone holding themselves together through sheer willpower and coffee. "This him?" she asked, leaning into the boat. "The one from the radio call?" "Yeah. Found him tied to what's left of a porch in Oak Ridge Heights. No sign of owners." She reached out slowly, letting Shadow sniff her hand before gently touching his drooping ear. "He's severely dehydrated. Probably hasn't eaten properly in days." I nodded. "He's still fighting, though." "Not fighting," Maya corrected, her eyes meeting mine. "Surviving. There's a difference." We brought him inside, to the area Maya had converted into a veterinary triage unit. Her assistant Travis helped transfer Shadow to an examination table, while Maya worked efficiently, checking vitals, starting fluids, cleaning wounds. Shadow remained perfectly still through it all, neither resisting nor responding. "He's in shock," Maya said finally, her voice softening. "But he's stable. White blood cell count suggests infection, likely from the neck wounds and whatever he's been drinking. We'll start antibiotics." I stood at the edge of the table, watching the gentle rise and fall of Shadow's chest. Someone left him there deliberately, tied him up, and just walked away. Maya met my eyes. Not anymore. That night, I slept on a cot beside Shadow's kennel in the makeshift animal shelter area. The hurricane had displaced hundreds of animals alongside their humans. The room echoed with occasional whimpers and barks, but Shadow remained silent. Around 3 a.m., I woke to movement. Shadow was awake, eyes reflecting the dim emergency lights. He was watching me. Slowly, deliberately, he extended his paw through the kennel bars and touched my hand. Not a demand, not even a request, just connection. I covered his paw with my palm and stayed that way until we both drifted back to sleep. Morning brought chaos as fresh evacuees arrived. Maya appeared with coffee and dark circles under her eyes. "He made it through the night," she said, kneeling beside Shadow's kennel. "That's a good sign." Shadow was more alert now, his eyes tracking our movements. Not fearfully, but with careful observation. He was reading us, learning the patterns of this new reality. Maya opened the kennel door slowly and offered a small bowl of soft food. "Maya, open it." Shadow looked at it, then at me, as if seeking permission. "Go ahead," I encouraged. "It's all yours." He ate slowly, methodically, as if each bite might be his last. When he finished, he looked up again, his eyes a fraction less hollow. When he finished, he looked up again, his eyes... Maya sat back on her heels. Good appetite. That's promising. But there was something in the way he moved, cautious, contained, as if he was still bound by invisible rope. His body had been freed, but his mind remained tied to whatever had happened before the hurricane, before being abandoned. "He doesn't know he's safe yet," I said quietly. Maya glanced at me. "Do any of us?" 3 days later, the emergency shelter began to empty as relief organizations connected evacuees with temporary housing. The animal section, however, remained full. Pets waiting for owners who might never return. Strays rescued from flooded areas. Wildlife displaced by destruction. I'd been sleeping beside Shadow every night, and each morning he seemed incrementally more present. He would now stand when I approached, even take a few steps to meet me. But he never made a sound, never wagged his tail. "Time to go home," I told him on the 4th day, clipping a new leash to his collar, or what passes for home these days. My rental cabin had survived the hurricane, situated on higher ground outside town. It wasn't much, just a small living room, kitchenette, bedroom, and porch, but it was dry and intact, which made it luxury housing compared to what most locals had left. Shadow walked into the cabin like he was entering unknown territory. He took 2 steps past the threshold and froze, eyes darting to each corner, body tense. I let the leash go slack, giving him space to explore or retreat as needed. "It's okay," I said, keeping my voice casual. "Nothing here will hurt you." He stood motionless for several minutes, then slowly, with deliberate care, made his way to the far wall and lay down on the floor. Not on the dog bed I'd prepared, not on the rug, just the bare floor, facing the door. I didn't push. I moved around him, unpacked supplies, made coffee, left a water bowl and food nearby. The whole time, his eyes followed me, alert but not anxious, not afraid of me, but of the possibility of attachment. As evening fell, I sat cross-legged on the floor a few feet from him and spoke quietly. "I know what it's like," I said, "to guard yourself against hope, to prepare for the worst, because that's all you've known." I wasn't even sure if I was talking to him or myself anymore. But sometimes the worst doesn't come. Shadow didn't move at first. Then, inch by painstaking inch, he crawled toward me until his head rested lightly against my knee. I felt something crack open inside my chest, something I'd carefully walled off after too many failed rescues, too many bodies found too late. That was the first night I allowed myself to cry since the hurricane hit. Not dramatic sobs, just silent tears while my hand rested on Shadow's back, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing against my palm. For the next week, Shadow followed me everywhere. Not playfully, not eagerly, but with quiet determination, like a shadow given form and purpose. If I stopped moving, he would sit precisely 3 feet behind me, silent and watchful. He wouldn't sleep unless I was nearby. Each night I'd place his bed next to mine, and he would lie at the exact edge, close enough to touch but careful not to impose. The moment I shifted in my sleep, he would wake instantly, alert and ready. It wasn't fear of the dark. It was fear of being alone in it. 8 days after I brought him home, another storm hit. Not a hurricane, just a normal thunderstorm, but the first rain since the disaster. The first crack of thunder sent Shadow bolting under the bed, body shaking so violently the frame rattled. I lay flat on the floor, extending my hand under the bed without reaching for him. "It's okay," I said. "Just rain. You're inside now. You're safe." But his eyes were wild, his breathing rapid and shallow. He wasn't hearing me. He was back there, tied to a porch as waters rose, as wind howled, as everything familiar disappeared. I dragged my blanket and pillow onto the floor and lay there all night, not touching him, just present. Somewhere around dawn, he crawled out and pressed himself against my side, his whole body still trembling. "The storm always passes," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "It always ends eventually." The next morning broke clear and cool. I opened the cabin door to assess any new damage and stepped onto the porch. To my surprise, Shadow followed, hesitating at the threshold as he had every day before. But this time, something was different. He lifted his nose, sniffing the clean, rain-washed air. Then, with no warning, he took 1 step forward, then another. And suddenly, he was trotting around the small yard, not running exactly, but moving with purpose, investigating leaves and puddles with cautious curiosity. I laughed, genuinely laughed, for the first time in weeks. "Look at you," I called. "You're remembering how to be a dog." He glanced back at me, and for a brief moment, the permanent worry in his eyes lifted. Later, he came back inside and, instead of returning to his spot against the wall, jumped onto the couch and settled there, his body visibly more relaxed than I'd ever seen it. I sat beside him, careful not to make too much of this milestone. He rested his head on my lap without prompting. "You don't have to wait by the door anymore," I told him softly. "No one's leaving you behind again." And for the first time since I'd found him, I thought maybe he believed me. Shadow began to come alive in small, significant ways. Not all at once, but in moments that accumulated like raindrops filling an empty vessel. First came his ears, both standing upright now, when he heard the refrigerator open. Then the tentative tail movement when I returned from checking the mail. 2 weeks after bringing him home, he barked. A single, startled sound when a deer appeared in the yard. The sound surprised us both, and he looked at me as if seeking approval or perhaps forgiveness for the noise. "Good boy," I said, and his tail moved hesitantly, just once, back and forth. We settled into a routine. Wake at dawn, coffee, and breakfast for both, then drive to whichever part of the community needed help with rebuilding that day. Shadow would stay in the truck or follow close behind as I helped clear debris, deliver supplies, or assist with repairs. People began to recognize him. Hurricane Dog, they called him, but with respect in their voices. 3 weeks after the storm, my phone rang. It was Maya. "How's our survivor doing?" she asked. "Better, more present. Still quiet, but different." "I'm headed to the Veterans Center today," she said. "They've set up a temporary support group for people who lost everything. Some struggling with trauma responses." A pause. "I think Shadow might help." I hesitated, looking at him curled on the couch. "I don't know if he's ready for crowds." "Maybe he is," Maya said. "Maybe you both are." I thought about it after hanging up. The truth was, I'd been avoiding large gatherings. After years of pulling bodies from rubble, from floodwaters, from collapsed buildings, I'd developed my own set of triggers. Crowds, confined spaces, the specific quality of silence that follows disaster. That night, I found myself talking to Shadow as we sat on the porch watching stars emerge. "I left search and rescue after losing too many," I told him. "My last mission, we were too late. An entire family. I promised myself I wouldn't open that part of me again." I looked down at him, his head resting on my foot. "But then I found you, still waiting despite everything." Shadow didn't move, but his eyes held mine, unblinking and attentive. The next day, we went to the Veterans Center. The center was operating out of a church basement, one of the few buildings in town with minimal damage. No signs, no fanfare, just a space where people could gather and feel less alone with their losses. I wasn't sure what to expect, but when we walked in, Shadow didn't freeze or hide behind me. Instead, he walked calmly at my side, his body language neither fearful nor defensive, just present. About 15 people sat in a rough circle on folding chairs. Some looked up when we entered. Others stared at the floor, lost in their own thoughts. One man, older, with weathered hands that trembled slightly, sat apart from the others, his face set in lines of exhausted grief. Without hesitation, Shadow walked directly to him, bypassing everyone else, and gently placed his head on the man's knee. The man looked down, startled, then closed his eyes and whispered something too low for me to hear. His hand came to rest on Shadow's head, and for a long moment they remained that way, perfectly still, connected. "He knows," the man said finally, looking up at me with eyes that had seen too much. "Doesn't he?" I nodded. "I think he does." That's when I realized Shadow hadn't just survived his ordeal. He had understood it in a way that transcended language, in a way that allowed him to recognize the same pain in others. Word about Shadow spread quickly through the recovering community. By the end of the month, the center had invited us back regularly. We didn't do anything formal, no therapy certification, no structured interactions. We simply showed up, sat in the room, and remained available. Somehow, that was enough. People began to acknowledge Shadow by name. Some would quietly pet him as they entered the room. Others would just nod in his direction. Shadow didn't demand attention or interaction. He offered presence, and that was precisely what many needed most. During our third visit, a younger man walked in and stopped abruptly when he saw Shadow. Ethan, I would later learn his name was. Mid-30s, with visible burn scars on his arms and neck, and anger etched into every line of his body. He stared at Shadow for a long moment, then said flatly, "I had a dog like that. Before." The room went quiet. Before had become our community's shorthand for everything that existed prior to the hurricane. "She didn't make it," Ethan added, his voice dropping slightly. "Couldn't get back to the house in time." Shadow stood up from where he'd been lying and walked over to sit beside Ethan's chair. Not touching him, not looking at him directly, just positioned nearby. Ethan didn't acknowledge him, but he didn't move away either. They simply occupied the same space, sharing the same air, the same silence. After the session, Ethan found me in the parking lot. "Where'd you find him?" he asked, nodding toward Shadow. "Tied to what was left of a porch in Oak Ridge Heights," I replied, still waiting for someone to come back. Ethan nodded, looked away, then said, "That's what this feels like after something like this. Like you're tied to a spot that doesn't exist anymore, watching for something that's never coming back." I didn't respond immediately. Shadow stepped forward and pressed his head against Ethan's leg. For a moment, Ethan went completely still. Then he dropped to one knee and wrapped his arms around Shadow, his body shaking with silent sobs. That's when I stopped thinking of Shadow as the dog I had rescued. He was rescuing others now, in his own quiet way. He didn't perform tricks or follow commands. He simply recognized pain and honored it with his presence. And in a world where so many were running, from memories, from loss, from responsibility, Shadow's willingness to stay was profound. As weeks turned to months, the community slowly rebuilt. Shadow grew stronger physically, his coat becoming thicker, his body filling out to a healthy weight. But the most remarkable transformation was in his demeanor. He now walked confidently into every space, head high, steps steady, but never rushed, never careless. He developed an uncanny ability to identify the person in any room who needed him most. Why? Sometimes it was obvious, the individual crying quietly in a corner. Other times, his choices surprised me. The volunteer who seemed cheerful and energetic, but whom Shadow would sit beside with particular attentiveness. 3 months after the hurricane, the community center director asked if we would consider visiting the temporary school they'd established for children displaced by the storm. "They've heard about Shadow," she explained. "We've been talking about resilience and, well, he's become something of a local legend." I looked at Shadow, now sleeping peacefully on his bed, instead of vigilantly guarding the door. "What do you think?" I asked him. "Ready to meet some kids?" His tail thumped once against the floor. Clear. Certain. The school had been set up in a series of connected trailers on the community center grounds. About 20 children, ranging from 5 to 12 years old, sat cross-legged on a colorful carpet when we arrived. Some looked up eagerly. Others remained withdrawn, shoulders hunched against memories too heavy for their young frame. One girl, small, maybe 6 or 7, sat slightly apart from the others, her hoodie pulled up despite the room's warmth, her face hidden beneath the fabric. Shadow entered the room calmly, acknowledging the teacher's gentle pat with a brief tail wag. But he didn't linger. Instead, he walked directly to the girl in the hoodie, circled once, and lay down beside her, his body curved around her like a living shield. For several minutes, nothing happened. The teacher continued reading a story. The other children listened or fidgeted. Shadow remained motionless except for his steady breathing. Finally, a small hand emerged from the hoodie sleeve and hesitantly touched his ear. "Is he sad?" the girl whispered. So quietly, I almost missed it. I moved closer and knelt beside her. "He was for a long time," I said gently. "But he's learning to feel safe again." She nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense to her. Then, with deliberate care, she shifted her position and wrapped both arms around Shadow's neck, burying her face in his fur. Shadow didn't move except to rest his chin lightly on her shoulder, his eyes half closed in what looked remarkably like contentment. Later, as we prepared to leave, the girl, Lily, I learned her name was, approached me. "Shadow come back?" she asked, voice stronger now. "Some kids here. They need him." I smiled and nodded. "Yes, he'll come back. I promise." In the truck afterward, Shadow sat in the passenger seat, his head on the center console, eyes tired but peaceful. "You did good today," I told him, scratching behind his ears. "Really good." For the first time in our months together, Shadow leaned over and licked my hand. Just once, a quick, warm touch. But in that gesture, I felt his acknowledgement. He understood what he was doing, what he was becoming for others. He'd been waiting his whole life to matter to someone this way. Now, he mattered to many. The 1-year anniversary arrived with little fanfare. Exactly 12 months since I'd found Shadow tied to the remains of a porch, waiting for someone who was never returning. I'd thought about simply treating it as another day, but some moments deserve recognition, so we went back. The neighborhood had been partially rebuilt. Some homes stood whole again, others remained vacant lots. New structures rose where old ones had been washed away. But the particular spot where I'd found Shadow was still empty. Foundation visible, porch steps leading nowhere. Shadow stepped out of the truck and stood very still, surveying the changed landscape. His ears moved slightly, his nose lifted to catch the air. He was remembering, I could tell, but not with fear, with recognition. He walked forward on his own, stopping precisely where the porch had been. He sat down, exactly as I'd found him a year before, and looked at the road. But there was no desperation in his posture now, no desperate waiting, just quiet acknowledgement of what had been and what was now. I walked over and crouched beside him. "You remember, don't you?" I asked softly. He didn't respond except to lean slightly against my leg. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small metal tag. On it I'd had engraved 3 simple words, "Worth the wait." I attached it to his collar, next to his name tag and rabies vaccination disc. "You're not the dog who was left behind anymore," I whispered. "You're the one who stayed and helped others find their way back." Shadow pressed his head against my knee, and I knew the anniversary wasn't just about his story. It was about mine too. About all of us who had survived and found ways to rebuild not just structures, but ourselves. That evening, we sat on the porch of the cabin. My cabin now, purchased rather than rented, a commitment to staying in this community that had become home. Shadow lay beside my chair, his breathing deep and even in the cooling air. The light faded from gold to purple, stars appearing one by one in the darkening sky. In the distance, I could see the lights of the rebuilt town twinkling like earthbound stars. I reached down and rested my hand on Shadow's back, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart beneath my palm. And I realized something I hadn't fully acknowledged before. He saved me. Not through some dramatic rescue, not by protecting me from physical danger, but by showing me that even after devastation, after loss, after abandonment, love could survive. By proving that waiting wasn't weakness but a form of courage. The courage to believe that something better might still arrive, even when evidence suggested otherwise. Shadow's story isn't about being abandoned during a hurricane. It's about what happened afterward. After the rope was cut, after the wounds healed, after trust was rebuilt one small moment at a time. He didn't choose to be tied to that porch. He didn't choose to be forgotten. But he chose to keep loving. And that's what makes him extraordinary. He taught me that healing doesn't arrive in a grand moment. It comes in fragments. In a dog who follows you from room to room, in the first bark after months of silence. In the moment, a child's arms wrap around a neck once raw from rope. The dogs who change our lives don't do it by performing tricks. They do it by staying when everything else is gone, by witnessing our pain without trying to fix it, by showing us that sometimes the most profound thing we can offer another living being is our presence. If Shadow's story touches your heart, remember there are more dogs like him right now, waiting in shelters, tied in backyards, lost and hoping someone will see their worth. Be that someone. Dogs like Shadow don't just need rescue. They become rescuers themselves, healing wounds no medicine can touch. Thank you for taking this journey with us. If you have your own story of a special dog who changed your life, please share it in the comments below. Each one reminds us of the extraordinary bonds we form with these remarkable beings who teach us how to be more fully human. And if you'd like to join us for more stories like Shadow's, please subscribe to our channel. Together, we can change the world, one waiting heart at a time.